Imagine a world where every time you got frustrated, someone told you it was wrong. Every time you needed to move, someone made you sit still. Every time you expressed yourself in a way that felt natural, someone corrected you. For many children, especially autistic children, that world isn't imaginary. It's their daily reality. We've reached a point where typical childhood behaviors, tantrums, defiance, even the need to move and fidget, are being labeled as problems to fix rather than natural parts of growing up. But who decides what behavior is appropriate? And are we actually helping kids or just making them conform to an adult's idea of what's acceptable? Today, we're tackling the pathologizing of childhood behavior, how we as ABA practitioners, educators, and caregivers might be over-labeling natural behaviors as challenging. Are we truly teaching skills or are we forcing compliance? And most importantly, what does this mean for the long-term mental health and autonomy of neurodivergent children? Let's unpack this together. Welcome to Action Insights. I'm Nikki Dionne.
And I'm Amelia Dalphonse.
And we are coming to you today together in person, which is awesome since Amy and I live in different states. So if you're watching us on YouTube, you'll see that we are together. Talk a little bit about structure for today. So we offer CEUs for these podcasts. Throughout the podcast, there will be 3 code words. You'll need to go to the link in the description to buy CEUs for just $5. And then you'll use the code words to complete the quiz so that you can get access to your certificate for CEUs. So our first code word today is behavior.
Make sure you write that down because you're going to need it. But if you're listening in the car, please don't stop. Please don't write it down. Just use voice to text or something. But that first code word is behavior. I want to start by kind of defining what we mean when we talk about pathologizing behavior, because it's kind of a big word. But what we really are thinking about is how we often will think of typical developmentally appropriate behavior as challenging or even problematic because it doesn't align with what society wants or sees as normal behavior. Things like aggression or even stereotypies. Non-compliance is a big one that we pathologize as being a problem when in reality, it's just part of typical childhood development. All kids engage in these types of behaviors.
So thinking about, when we're talking about behavior in general, asking ourselves the question, are we holding autistic children to an unfair high standard just because they're receiving services or just because they qualify for services? Like thinking about how we're defining behavior across individuals versus looking at things, behaviors because somebody is autistic or because somebody is in services, and really thinking about, what does it mean to need services for things that are happening? So we all, I guess I could say that many of us have been in the grocery store, right? Or anywhere, or if you're a parent and you have a toddler, like the toddler has tantrums. We expect for children to engage in behaviors especially when they don't have communication to let us know what they need, or they haven't learned the skills to regulate their emotions. We expect that they might communicate through behavior. So tantrum behavior or behaviors, we might expect to see that. Yet when we work with autistic children, I know that in my history of things that, I'll work with a parent and they'll say, oh, tantrum. I'm like, yes, we'll work on tantrum behavior, but how do I start to quantify or, qualify what is typical developmental appropriate behavior versus behavior that might be targeted just because the client is autistic?
Right. I think that's true. And I used to work with autistic kids out in the community. And many times I have been in the community and the child that I'm working with is actually more well behaved than the kids that I see that are out in the community with their parents. The kids that I work with would take turns going down the slide, and they would they would go down the slide, not try to climb up, while other kids are there trying to come down the slide, and they would accept transitions away from the playground much better than the other kids that are there with their families or other caregivers. And so if we're already experiencing that level of socially appropriate behavior and they're still in services, I mean, I think they're doing pretty well when they are exceeding the behavior of what the those neuromajority peers are engaging in while in the same situation.
Right. And I think that as you were talking, I kind of think of, because my brain goes in 8 million different directions, but it starts to boil down to of like, are we normalizing, and I don't love that word, behavior based off like societal expectations of the neuromajority. And when we train out or teach out developmentally appropriate behaviors, are we really talking about helping someone function in their life more effectively, or are we really looking at compliance based, right? Like we're more restrictive based
Right.
outcomes. And I think this is kind of where, if you've been listening and you're learning anything, I live in a very, neurodiversity affirming place in trauma informed practice, which, we'll have multiple kind of episodes in the future talking about those things. But, when we start to think about that, I do think that for autistic advocates, at least in my understanding, really thinking about how are we kind of fitting autistic kids into this like social majority expectation versus really adjusting like what is developmentally appropriate and how are we helping kids really function to their true self. And I think that is where some of the advocacy starts to talk about harm.
Right.
And really thinking about our interventions, being really thoughtful about those things because we don't want to be causing harm or getting ourselves into ethical situations that could be not great.
Right. And that's so true. And I wonder, there's actually very little information out there on what is sort of acceptable levels of these types of behaviors for kids. And in reality, we did find a study that looks at what other kids, neuromajority type kids, engage in those types of behaviors. So it looked at 5 different behaviors. One of them was tantrums, aggression. I think one might be refusal, but we'll link to that in the description so you can check out the study. But as we were reading the study, it's a study that's conducted on kids who do already engage in high rates of challenging behavior, who might be seeking services to address those behaviors. So in reality, I mean, I used to be a preschool teacher. I know that the neuromajority kids engage in a lot of challenging behaviors because they're developing and they're learning their skills and they're testing their limits, and kids engage in behaviors that's just typical. And so how, as a BCBA, how are we supposed to know what would be acceptable? Generally, we go and fall back on the 80%, but that's so just standardized and it has no real meaning. And it's just the number that we tend to use universally across the field. So how much aggression is actually expected? And one of the things that I teach a lot is that no behavior is completely inappropriate because it might just not be appropriate to the context. Mm-hmm. So, for example, aggression is generally something that we see as an inappropriate behavior. But if somebody's trying to kidnap me, aggression is actually a really desirable behavior. You really want somebody to be reacting to that in an aggressive way. So if somebody tries to nab my kid, I want my kid to lash out at that person. So even aggression is something that in the right context can be appropriate. If you're kickboxing or something, then aggression is an expected behavior. Tantrums might be an expected behavior of a 1.5 or 2-year-old who doesn't have the language capacity to get their needs met or to communicate their thoughts.
Right.
So,
And even thinking in addition to that, because, I live in a super co-regulation, emotional regulation kind of place, we wouldn't expect a 4-year-old to be able to regulate their emotions without support. And so when we can't do that in private events, right? I can't communicate at 3, like, hey teacher, I'm really sad that Amy stole my toy. Could you go get it back for me? Most of the time I'm going to feel something private event in my body. I can't communicate it because I don't have the language skills yet. And so then my behavior function is to do that, right? To show my displeasure of Amy taking my toy. Yet we have significantly different expectations for kids who are in services to, kind of extinguish that behavior. We teach communication as a skill, but almost all kids that age struggle with communication and regulating their emotions. Same thing if we're talking about, I think about teenagers and what is developmentally expected for teenagers. Well, teenagers are, testing the waters. They are becoming more autonomous individuals. They're significantly separating from their parents. They have new and their own interests. We won't even get into like social relationships. But we expect some challenge and pushback and negotiation and challenge with flexibility for teenagers. And yet I have, and this is the place that's hard as I think back to like, oh, I did this before. Oh gosh, like, as I've done services, we're talking about these things. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so guilty of this because for whatever reason, my supervisor said that's what I had to do, or that was what the research was telling me, or, I got peer supervision and that's where we lived in this place. And, the important part is we're growing. But, I've worked with teenagers before who are in services and I'm like, oh, can't do that, right? Because I used to live in a more compliance-based place. And now when we start to integrate more understanding about trauma and, you know, positive and reinforcement and really looking at developing relationships and we take a step back, we recognize that teenagers, I use that group age group loosely, but teenagers are kind of across the span, are engaging in those behaviors because they're developmentally expected. Now if there are significant challenges because of the behaviors, and sure, we want to teach skills, but it also again doesn't mean that we want to eliminate those behaviors. And like Amy mentioned, there's not, when we look at kind of what the standard expectation is, like kids will engage in this behavior at this age, at this percent of the time, we don't really have that.
right.
Like we don't have it across all of the age span, whether they're 3 or 14. And so it, makes it harder when we're looking into the research, we're looking for those, metrics and those points that we're, data points that we're trying to collect, but what are we really matching them against? And it makes it harder.
Yeah. It's such a challenge because I think that we're really working to do the best that we can for the kids that we're working with. But who gets to decide what an appropriate level of challenging behavior is? Parents are frustrated, they're overwhelmed, and they're exhausted, and they don't want they want help and they want us to make the behavior better. So they definitely don't want us to say, well, your kid's engaging in a tantrum and we kind of expect that. We're not going to work on that. They want us to work on that. And so how do we then address the needs of the family while also understanding the needs of the child and the fact that this is pretty developmentally appropriate? We can do a lot of parent coaching and help them understand that aspect of it, that this is part of development. But a lot of us, I mean, I have a background in early childhood education and a lot of developmental education as well. So I have a background in that, but a lot of people who are coming up through the psychology field aren't getting those types of classes. But then I also think it's important to think about the shift that we're experiencing, not just in ABA, but also in our culture. So a lot of things as in the United States, so parenting itself is changing. And so our I think a lot of parents are starting to accept and understand that kids are using behavior as a method of communication. And so there's all of the shift towards more gentle parenting and more encouragement of autonomy, even for neuromajority kids. So there is that shift in our culture, which is making it a little bit easier, I think, to be able to tell parents that, hey, I understand these tantrums are tough and they're frustrating. Let's think about it from the child's perspective and why these behaviors are happening.
And sometimes, with that shift, and even just with my experience, right? So I don't know if I mentioned, but I've been a therapist for over 18 years, a mental health therapist, and I've been a BCBA only for 3. So, my foundation has been in mental health for many, many years. And then, I just magically became a BCBA. Just kidding. I, did the stuff, got certified as a BCBA. And, kind of thinking about how are we having these conversations with the people that we're working with, right? How are we talking to our caregivers when they come in and they say, this behavior is happening? And more often than not, I hear, caregivers will say, oh, I was talking to, and they name some professional, right? And the professional told me that this wasn't okay. Like, we know that my child's autistic and I better get them into services right away so we can, pretty much quote unquote fix this behavior. And so sometimes caregivers are coming in even with this pressure, this outside pressure to shift what's happening. And so a lot of times the conversation I start with is really thinking about, we have this behavior that's occurring. Let's talk about what, we might be expecting to see at this age anyway. Talk about how it's impacting the child and the child's functioning versus, the community, or, what might be happening outside, and then broaden it out. And then I start to talk about what are the skills that we need to teach in order to allow that behavior to decrease, right? And because that's what we want to have happen anyway, regardless of who we would be talking to that has a 3-year-old. We don't want tantrum behavior to continue until they're 10, right? At that point, it's not developmentally appropriate. I guess, I don't know. But anyway, we'll go with it for today. And we also need to allow the child to have some natural expression, because if we don't, we are at significant risk. And I'm going to go back to it. I know I said it a few minutes ago, but we're at significant risk of unintentionally doing some harm to the clients that we're working with. And that leads to our second code word for today, which is harm. So our second code word, if you're interested in CEUs, is harm. So, kind of thinking about harm in general, I have been doing a lot of reading lately on masking. And, I think we probably, now I'm thinking aloud, we're going to do a whole podcast on masking at some point. But briefly, especially autistic masking occurs when autistic individuals suppress the natural behaviors to fit into the social context environment that they're in. And when people engage in masking, it's linked to increased anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation later in life. So we have to remember, or I tell myself, I have to remember when I do supervision and trainings, like, we have to remember that these 3-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 14-year-olds that we're working with grow into adults who now have this entire history of being engaged in service. And if harm was done and they were taught that their natural expression of needs was not okay and that they had to suppress that, we really are potentially, creating situations where people are feeling more anxious, are feeling more depressed, or experiencing more suicidal ideation than they would if they didn't, or weren't in those situations where masking was something that they engaged in.
Yeah, we definitely need to be careful of that. And what came to mind is a lot of times I've seen a lot of this driven by schools, because the child's engaging in a behavior that's disruptive at school. So it needs to be corrected because it's disrupting the other kids' learning. And I mean, that happens a lot with stereotypic behavior, which is a the topic of an upcoming podcast. So we'll get into that a lot. But even things that are not stereotypies, the refusal and some of the more common behaviors that we see as problematic that we target for reduction, a lot of that comes from schools because it's so disruptive. But then I think about like the experiences of all the kids in schools. It's not just autistic kids who are struggling in our school systems. Schools in general right these days aren't meeting the needs of any of the kids because kids should be active learners, and a third grader shouldn't be sitting through a lecture all day. I mean, imagine sitting through it. And we talked about it this weekend when we were at an event that we were at planning for our upcoming CEU event. But schools in general are just struggling to meet the needs of the kids because these kids should be practicing and moving and actively engaged in learning. And so it's happening for all kids, not just autistic kids. They're expected to suppress all of the natural urges to get up and move around and to ask questions and to interrupt, because kids are going to interrupt. But then they turn to us to fix that behavior so that the kids aren't interrupting, and they're just sitting quietly and listening and absorbing the information.
So funny that you brought that up, because as we were chatting, I was like, oh, we had this conversation this weekend. And one of the BCBAs that we were talking to was, saying, I originally I thought, why can't my kids sit still, right? We think about that. Why can't our kids sit still in school all day? And then you really start to break it down. And most schools are 6.5 hours long through the day. Imagine sitting and learning for 6.5 hours every day with some minor breaks in between, lunch, passing between classes, if that's something you do, or walking to the next, kind of class with your peers. Having to be on and learning for 6.5 hours a day, 5 days a week, for however many days our, school is in session. And I think that as an adult, if I go to a 6.5 hour training for one day, I am so tired at the end of the day. And I am diagnosed with ADHD and have a sensory processing disorder and a tic disorder. So, I have a lot of neurodivergent needs as well. And I am a high masking, cis female who learned later in life that this is why I was struggling, that ADHD was a thing. When I go to trainings, it is so challenging for me to sit through those trainings. Sitting in school is so hard. And you're right. So we start to think about the environments that we're asking all kids to sit in. And I also wonder sometimes for neuromajority kids, sure, they're taught to sit still and maybe they can do it, but what's the long-term impact on that for kids, right? In general. So then we're not just talking about one population of children who, we have to be thoughtful about problematic behavior. But again, what do we expect for any single person sitting still for, I'm just going to repeat it, for 6.5 hours a day, Monday through Friday, for however many days school's in session, 9 months, 8 months, something like that, 8.5 months. So when you start to compound that out, it sounds torturous, just saying it, and really thinking about the expectations that we're putting on all kids to be in those situations is just kind of mind-blowing to me.
And it becomes the environment that's the problem, not the behavior. Yeah. So if we were to shift the environment for any of these kids, all of them would probably be performing a lot better and engaging in more appropriate type behaviors for the situations that they're in. So,
if all kids had movement breaks, or this weekend we were talking about, we have noise canceling headphones for, I have so many autistic kids I work with where we've gotten them noise canceling headphones, right? So that they can feel comfortable. But why can't all kids have access to noise canceling headphones? So that if we have a child who's engaging in behaviors that somebody right now might determine disruptive, but is a natural expression of what they need in the moment, that everyone has access to those accommodations so that the child can then stay in the classroom, right? Or can stay in the playground area, or can stay in whatever environment they're in, because the entire, environment is really designed for all children to have access to the same needs. And then what we start to do is we start to decrease this gap between, kids who are in services who need special things. If I had a person tell me that special things was what was needed, and like, kind of kids who are not in services and don't need those things, it becomes across, the lifespan that we all have access to similar accommodations.
And wouldn't it be great if, because we talk about self-advocacy for a lot for our kids, and a lot of times the kids that I work with, often they don't have the communication skills to be able to truly advocate and communicate what they need. But wouldn't it be great if we start teaching those self-advocacy skills to all kids? And this becomes something that is an integral part of the education system. I think the education system hasn't fully kept up with the developments in AI and knowledge, so we're still teaching kids to memorize dates and facts and numbers and calculations and things, when there's all sorts of new ways to get at the answers to those simple basic questions, that we don't need to be focused so much on teaching that in school, where we could teach self-advocacy. We could have time to teach other really important skills. And I know that it doesn't really help compete against companies who are developing technology, but it does help create a successful workforce as kids are getting older. And if a kindergartner learns self-advocacy skills and they're able to practice and adapt them throughout their entire educational career, then once they're out in the workforce, they're going to be able to advocate for their needs, communicate, come up with better ideas. And I mean, I just think that in general, it would be such an amazing thing for kids to learn, not just the minority kids, or the kids that receive additional services.
Yeah. And I think it also, kind of sets up really finding the right path for everybody based off of what their needs and their kind of skill set is, right? So I think of a child I worked with once, and I remember them coming into services, and the thing was like, they're just going to live at home forever, like already we're like, this is the referral. And I'm always a challenge accepted kind of person. Like, let's break down the barriers. Like, why are we limiting anybody? As long as we can teach the skill and it's something that the person that we're working with wants to learn. So like, having autonomy and assent in the treatment is important as well. And, I won't go through all the things, but this very young child who came in, like, we found interest. I worked with a really great school. I have some really good schools, up in New Hampshire that I work with, who do an amazing job with all of the things. So I also want to say that there are some schools who are doing all of these things that are just amazing. And then there are others that, kind of fall short. And I think Amy and I, we won't go off on that tangent, but have very different experiences based on where we live right now with our interactions with education system in general. And this kid like grew up to, work, I'm not going to tell you like, but like in the outdoors, like independent, working a job that fits with their needs, because we, really worked hard to not pathologize the behavior. So like that leads to the question, like, what do we do as BCBAs? How are we aware of this? And like, what are the things that we're doing to make sure that we're supporting all of the people that we're working with, whether it's our direct client, their caregiver, the collaterals that we're working with, right? Because we don't work with kids in a vacuum. I work with them and then I send them into their, education environment. I send them into possibly a child care environment or a social situation. So like, how are we, as BCBAs really looking at behaviors in general and maybe reclassifying or redefining what we're working on? It's like the big question, right?
Yes. I think that that's definitely something that we're going to, I'm sure, come back to over and over again, because it's such an important question. And there is right now no answer, but how are we going to be able to come up with an acceptable level of what we call challenging behavior, and make sure that we're supporting everyone in expressing their needs, but also accepting that we all are going to fall short at times, including our youngest kids that we're working with, and that's okay. And it doesn't mean that ABA is failing. It means maybe, hopefully, that ABA is successful in helping them.
I always live in this interesting place when I do like mental health therapy in general. And I say that we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes. I could tell you a million examples that I'm not proud of, so I won't
Yes.
because of time. But
Not today.
where
It's another episode.
where I have done something with the best of intentions because I want to help the people that I'm supporting, and with reflection, look back and say, oh gosh, now that I have this new information, or I've learned more, I've connected with people who have similar values that I have, where things have, maybe been able to shift a little bit. And I think one piece that I really live in is like developing autonomy. So our third code word for today is autonomy, and really thinking about separately the reflection that we're engaging in. Are we respecting autonomy? Are we respecting dignity? What is the long-term well-being that we're working on versus short-term goals to help, manage problem behavior? And if anything is compliance based, I would just say foundationally, that's a good place to start questioning.
I think that's a great place to pause and think about those things. So I think that is going to wrap it up for today. Our next episode is going to be on the ethics of eliminating stereotypies. And we're going to ask the question, who really benefits when that's a behavior that we target? We have a lot of really interesting thoughts on that, and we will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for joining us for Action Insights. We'll talk to you next time.